Hello and welcome. In this tutorial, we are going to do a couple of things. First, we're going to look at a whole portion of modeling tools or generators that I haven't even gotten into yet. Kind of an oversight on my part, but we're going to introduce a couple of these things called deformers that are really pretty fantastic and magical. And then we're going to be looking at how to make materials that act differently than materials we've seen thus far. So really, we've been focused on materials, making materials that look correct when light hits that front surface that's facing the camera and bounces back to the camera. And when all of that light hits that surface and reflects, right? Or maybe it's just a flat material. Now, there's a lot of other materials out there. There's plastics, there's human skin, there's candle wax, there's translucent bags, there's all sorts of things that light passes through or it enters into a little bit, but then it bounces around a bit and comes back out, right? So like if you, put a flashlight against your hand and shine a light through your hand, you are going to see light, right? Light goes through your hand, but it's not clear, it's not transparent, right? It's something that we, at least in 3D lingo, is called subsurface scattering. And what that means is light enters the surface and it hits stuff in that surface and then bounces around and exits at a different angle. And then also each wavelength of light is going to bounce around differently and get absorbed more or less based on its energy level. And so, right, when you shine a white light through your hand, all you see is like reds and oranges because all the blue light is getting blocked as it moves through your hand. Now, you might see a little bit of blue from like your veins or something like that, but otherwise, right, it's all the rest of that light is getting blocked. Okay, and I'm sorry I have a sniffle this morning. It warmed up and my allergies are firing off like crazy. So let's start with deformers, because what we're going to do is we're going to make a candle and we're going to light the candle and light a scene with a candle, right? We're not going to be looking at the flame itself. This is not a tutorial about how to make the fire. We're just going to be using a point source light, but we're going to be looking at how that light transmits through the surface, right? And one of the things with human skin, and the reason if you've tried modeling skin without using subsurface scattering, it looks really flat and plasticky and glossy and weird, is because, right, the way light not only from the front surface hits our skin, but also light from the back surface, right? So like if there's like bright sunlight over my shoulder, my ear, right, may be kind of translucent a little bit, or it's not quite as shadowed as it otherwise would be because of the way light works and the way that subsurface scattering works. Okay, so let's go ahead and we're going to start by just making a cylinder. And this cylinder, we should go ahead and turn on display garage shading lines. One of the things with subsurface scattering is, though you can set your settings regardless of scale, you can make a candle that's the size of a, skyscraper. And if you adjust the path lengths and stuff correctly, you can make it look like a candle that you did to scale. But because we're going to be putting this in with the cups eventually and looking at how we can make other kind of plasticky materials, we should probably do this as one at an accurate scale to a candle. So I'm basically going to divide this all by 10. So it's going to be 5 centimeters in radius, and it will be 20 centimeters in height. Once I've done that, right, it looks tiny on there. If I just hit the letter S on the keyboard, it will pop me into a full zoom on this object. And so I've got this thing set up. Now, one of the things I'm going to want to do is I'm going to eventually make this editable, and I'm going to be pushing, right, the center here down some. So we have like a lip as though the candle's, right, melted in a little bit, and that's also going to be how we hide the fact that we aren't modeling a flame right now. So before I make this editable, just to get started, I'm going to go to my caps, and I'm going to increase the segments on my caps to, I think 4 was what I did previously. That should probably be good, because what I'd like is, right, I'd like the wax to be able to kind of wicks up to the to the wick. Oh, right. So we want this to kind of dip down and come back up. And I might actually I'm going to do 5 subdivision segments on the top. For the object segments, honestly, it's probably fine in the height. I might want to make the rotation 32, which adds a lot of stuff here, but we're only going to be really modeling with the edges and maybe selecting rings of polygons. But it's going to be very basic with what we do. So having this many polygons on the top surface isn't going to be a problem for us. Okay, so I'm happy with my candle. I am going to hit C on my keyboard so it is editable. And then I'm going to make sure I'm going to come down to one of these side views, and I want to just lift this up so it's at least level with the floor-ish. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it's there. Okay, so let's go ahead and start making the top of this candle. So I'm going to go ahead and go to Edges mode. Yeah, and I'm going to say UL, right? Hit U and L on the keyboard so I can get my loop selection. I'm going to start by selecting this ring and these 3 rings here. Actually, no, sorry, I've made a mistake already. Jeez. I'm going to start by selecting, and I'm zooming in a little bit. Start by selecting this ring and this ring. I'm going to hit the letter E on the keyboard. I'm just going to pull these down. And you'll see, right, I'm intentionally doing this, and I'm not using extrude or anything right now. I'm just going to be using some of these things to scale these in and out. So I'm going to click off. I'm going to hit UL again. I'm going to select this edge. I'm going to hit the letter T to scale. And I'm going quicker through this because, right, we've done several modeling tutorials now. So hopefully you're starting to understand this process how we model, right? So UL again, select this inner ring. I might scale this in just a touch, and then I'm going to use U and L again. I'm going to maybe have to zoom a little bit more so I can grab this, and I'm going to hit the letter E, right, so I can move this down. I'm just going to pull this down, and I kind of want this to actually be like a little bit, right, almost to have a curve, like a concave curve up to that top point. And for now, I'm going to say I am done. I actually want to move all of the center geometry down a little bit lower, though. So I'm going to go ahead and hit UL. And you'll notice right now, if I was to actually try and just use edge selections, I'm not going to be able to get that center point. So in this case, it's probably better to go to my polygon selection tool. So I can just go ahead and select all 3 of those, hit E, and I'm just going to push everything down just a little bit further into the body of this candle. Okay, now let's go even further. It's been melting for a while, and I'm doing this for a couple of reasons. But and then the other thing I'm going to do is, well, we'll put the deformer on here first, and then we'll see how it looks and see what changes we can make. So deformers are available under this bend object, right? All of these purple things are called called deformers. And they allow you to take whatever mesh you make them a child of and deform it in some way, right? So if I was to put bend on the cylinder and then select bend and increase the strength a little bit, right, you can see that it is doing some crazy things right now. Part of that is because the size of this deformer is absolutely massive. If I click fit to parent, it's going to snap down to the actual size of my object, and I'm going to have a much different reaction. I want you to note with bend, so also each one of these has very different settings, so there's no way I'm going to be able to go through all of them today, and I have no intention of doing that. We're just going to look at bend, and then we're going to look at displace. But I want you to note that if you try and bend something with no, like if I was to create a cube really quick and create another bend deformer and put this on the cube, right, and then try to bend my cube, you'll see that it's not really bending. It's more like it's warping it in one way or another. And that's because bend is only going to be able to bend things at joints, right? So you can imagine, like, if I had a cut here, and let's see what that looks like, it's going to bend a little bit better. So if I was to say the Y segment here, right, oh look, I've got more bend. If I was to keep increasing this along the axis or along the direction that it's being bent, right, I'm going to get a smoother and smoother bend. And so if I go back to my bend and crank this up a little bit more, right, so you can see, right, I can get a much smoother bend. I can actually create, you know, like a ring or whatever. And so this is a really handy, these are handy tools. Bend is great for certain things. It's kind of annoying for, like, I feel like every time I try and use it, it fails me at some point because of the way it's set up. But I'm not super concerned about that right now. So let's go ahead and delete this one. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and hit S so I can, oops, I'm going to select the cylinder, hit S. So we're here, and I don't know why the cylinder decided not to be bending anymore. There we go. Oh, just because I have it selected and not the bend. So deformers are great. They're also really awesome in terms of animating things. Like, I don't know if you noticed, but these bend and then they rotate a bit. Like if you were animating blades of grass or something like that, this is a really fantastic way to do it. Okay, so I am going to take the bend off. The one I'm going to use, and there are a bunch, you should experiment with these. Shear, taper, bulge, and twist are all pretty similar to bend. And then there's a whole bunch of other ones. And later in the course, we're going to look at wrap and spline wrap and some of these others. We're not going to look at all of them, but there's just, I mean, there's just a ton. And they have, some of them have very specific uses like point cache and what's the other one that correction. Both of those have very specific uses. But today we're going to use displacer. Now what displacer does is displacer allows you to use a shader to affect the geometry. So what does that mean? Well, a shader is, say, like when we've been working in Redshift and we're building our materials, what we're doing is we're creating a shader. And so there are simpler shaders and more complex shaders. And if we have our displacer and we drop this on our cylinder and we go down to shading, you'll see that the channel says custom shader. There's like a bunch of other possible options. We're just going to leave it at custom shader. And then we could either click on this drop down arrow or we could click on this field here, which wouldn't really help us at this point. But I'm going to go ahead and click on my drop down field. And you'll see that there are several options in here. And this is, because we're doing Redshift, we haven't really looked at this menu. This is like the standard or the classic part of the classic material making system. And so it's like the older way to do things, but it works. So I'm going to, in this case, it works really well. So I'm going to go to noise, because what we want is not that. We don't want like a Italian futurist sculpture of a camera, a candle, excuse me. Right? Like this is a little, something is crazy, but you can kind of see immediately, right, what happens and how much deviation and change we can have occur on the surface of an object. So if I go, so I'm going to start by clicking on my object field, or my object tab over here on my displacer, and you'll see that the height is set to 10 centimeters and the strength is set to 100. So there's these two things work in together, and then there's this type that says intensity centered currently, and intensity, and there's some other options here. We're not going to worry about any of the RGB, red, green, or whatever, just intensity and intensity centered. So these two settings basically mean how far out should it push or pull the object, and should it start where the object begins, right? So should it start, if I turn this off, should it start here and only go out with this, essentially the default state being 0%, and then, 10 centimeters being 100%, or should it be centered? Should we come, if we do the centered, that means this is 0.5 or 50%, and then 0% would be, all the way in, and 100% would be twice the existing distance, right? And so it really depends on what you're working on. In our case, centered is going to be fine. We just don't need 10 centimeters. And I did turn this off. I'm turning it back on. Let's do 1 centimeter and see what we get. Okay, so we've got a lot more wiggle here, right? But this is actually starting to look kind of nice. Now, one of the issues is that I would really like this to be, to have more, a little bit more wobble kind of happening up on the top part of this surface. And so we need to go ahead and maybe add a little bit more geometry. We need to do a couple loop cuts. So I'm going to select my cylinder. I'm going to hit K and L. And I'm going to come up here and I'm just going to do a few cuts on the inside and outside just to give me a little bit more variation here. And I might even do one along the center. But I just want to, because these are pretty big areas without any sort of, geometry applied, I'm just going to do this. It may not be perfect, right? This is a demo. I would likely test this out a bit more and do it like several times, but I'm not going to do that today. And so I just did like 2 cuts on the top there. It looks like I made 3 segments on the sides. I cut this one. I had a pretty big gap here that I made smaller. And then I threw a few more on the sides here. They're not perfect. If I was really being persnickety, I could go into edges mode and I could use the slide tool. That's the edge cut. That's not what I want. I could use the slide tool, but I could say UL, and maybe on this one I could select this and then use the slide. And I could just like pull this up a little bit to even some of these out a touch, and do the same thing here. I think it's MO is slide. Yes, it is. All right, so I can pull this up too. And then we can select our displacer and see that now that we've added a little bit more geometry, we have that top surface, right, is a little bit more manipulated. And you can kind of see there's, a little something going on here where that edge is lifting up a bit too much on this side. And so I could continue to work this a touch and just maybe say UL in polygon editing mode and maybe just lift this these center polys up just a touch. And then we can select our displacer and see if that cleaned that up a little bit. And it looks like it did. Now, the other issue with this displacer is that, right, I'm pretty happy with what's going on that top surface. It looks, reasonably like a melted candle, but it's also impacting the entire body of this object. And I really don't want that to happen. I really just want to be focused at this point, and I'd like this to be more straight. So, by default, and the way that these work, there's no way to do that. You could, there's no way to adjust this with the settings that you have available, even with, all of these things here. However, there's another object or another, I don't know what you would call it, they're fields, is what we need to introduce. And what fields do is fields allow you to apply, to control where an effect is applied or where this displacer is applied on the object. And there's a whole bunch of different types of fields. One of the most common ones is linear field. You'll see there's a shader field, which, right, very similar. It basically works just like this displacer, but it's like the influence something has on it. There's random, there's a bunch of shapes and everything. We're going to start with a linear field because that's all we really need for this. So if I click on this linear field button, right, it's going to populate it here in this field. Oh boy, so many fields. And then the other thing to note is that fields are also available here. So I can create them here, and they'll just show up in my hierarchy, but they're not attached to anything. And so what I'd have to do is I'd want to go to my displacer And then I could, oh, and actually this one is attached. Let me go ahead and undo that and undo this. So why was this one attached? So basically, if I don't have anything selected in my hierarchy and I click create a field, it's not attached to anything, right? This one just has this one field that I've already got on there. However, if I have an object that will accept a field selected when I create a field, and it will automatically attach that field to the object, right? Even though it's up here and it's not connected to the object that it's impacting or affecting, it doesn't, it's connected. And you can always just select one of these and delete them if you don't want it connected later. So we've created this field and it's absolutely enormous. We need to make it a little bit smaller. But before we do that, because right now we can see it all pretty well without things overlaying each other, I'm going to explain how this works. So the way this works is you'll see there's like a directional arrow in here. And what it does is it starts from one state, from 0% of influence to 100% influence. And it's a gradient, right? A linear field is just essentially a gradient from, you could pretend it's from black to white, right? And what that means is that it's essentially, if you've used Photoshop or any program that allows you to mask something, like mask a layer or whatever, it works the same way, right? It's basically hiding or showing the impact of the displacer, right? And so what we can do now is, first, we know that we don't want this arrow going this direction, but let's just see what happens when it does. So first, we're going to shrink our length down substantially. If I have the field selected and if I make sure I'm in model mode, that little yellow dot appears there, and I can just pull this thing down. And if I zoom in a little bit and keep pulling this down, you're going to see that half of my object is deformed and half of my object is not deformed. So can you see if I roll through this direction, right, there's nothing is being deformed at all. If I slowly come through here, you can see that the deforming is starting to happen, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit more and adjust this so it's a little bit easier to see. And you can see as I go, right, it just continues to do that deformation. And so right now it's a very crisp edge, right? I've got, it's happening, that change happens very quickly. But if I extend this, I can spread that out, right? So I can say, okay, well, I want it to very gently go from 100% to 0%, right? And note that the direction of the arrow, this is 0, this is 100, right? Or 0 and 1, or whatever value system you want to use, black and white, all of that, right? So you can see how that works. Now, fields are amazing because they don't just work on this, they work on so many other things. But also, if for animating like a lot of changes in the surface of an object, you just animate the field moving through space and you can get really complex animations quickly. So let's get more onto this. So we don't want this to be going right along the x-axis. We want to be going along the y-axis. And so we're going to go ahead and switch this to y plus. I had the linear field selected, and I'm on the field tab, and I clicked on direction y plus. My length is currently set to 8.4 centimeters, which is probably fine, although it looks like a little bit. What I'd like to do, though, you can see I'm still getting this wobble on the side, so now if I just bring this up a little bit more, you'll see it's going to straighten out that thing, and I actually want to bring this length down a touch, because what I'd like to do is, now I'm trying to just move it up, is have this whole candle basically stay somewhat still until I get really close to that top edge. Right? I'd like it to have a little bit of wobble because, right, as a candle melts, the walls kind of sag out usually or fall in. And so now I've got this shape, and I could potentially, right, shrink this down more. which would allow me to have the sides stay straight longer. It's really up to you at this point, but you can see that, right, using a deformer, the displaced deformer with a linear field, I get a pretty good result. Now, something I do want to show you with the displacer is all we did was we just used the default noise value. If you want to change this, right, you can use all sorts of different types of noise, just like you can with the max on noise node in Redshift. If I click on noise, I have a whole bunch of settings that come up. Most of those are going to look very similar to what we've already looked at in the max on noise thing, because it's basically, they repackaged it for this. Right, so if I wanted to adjust the type of noise, or the other thing that you can always adjust is if you're happy with, like, let's say I was happy with just the default noise wherever that went, there it is. But maybe I want to adjust the seed value, and the seed value just says, like, you know, what, right, if we look at this image here and I adjust the seed value, you'll see basically where these points are is different. And you can see we can get some really different results here. So you can click through this, and each one's, it's not like this isn't like a linear change. It's like a very dramatic change, because the seed value just triggers the whole system to put this random noise together. And so, yeah, so you can find one that you're happy with. And I kind of liked 669 was a great number. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. And the reason, actually, I think this is better. 670 is better for our purposes. And the reason it's better for our purposes is because part of the wall is really thin here and part of the wall is really thick. And when we're doing our next steps, that's going to give us a pretty good understanding of how subsurface shading works. Okay, so I'm in a really good place with this model. I'm going to go ahead and do one last thing, because I am going to want to put this in a subdivision surface or use a Redshift object to tessellate it, and which is the same thing. And so what I'm going to do is I want this bottom edge to remain pretty hard. So I need to add one more row of polygons down here at the bottom. So I'm just going to do, I'm in edges mode. I'm going to say KL so I can do a loop cut. And I'm just going to come down close to the bottom edge so that that rounding isn't quite so intense when this happens, right? So I want just like an edge there, and I know the bottom edge already has, let's see here, plenty of polygons. So, right, if you remember, if you have a whole area with like a lot of a big polygon surface, it's going to be bent, or the average is going to be a lot different, and I'll get like more rounding, and I want a little less rounding, so I wanted an edge reasonably near the bottom. But a little rounding, right, candles are never perfectly square anywhere, because they're made of wax, which is soft. So yeah, so a little bit of bending there is going to be great for us later on. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save the scene, and we're going to end this tutorial here, and then we'll look at subsurface scattering in the next section. So I'm just going to call this candle. And we're also going to look at merging scenes, because we are going to be using the wine glasses from the previous tutorial in this scene as well.